the atmosphere has just been different the last couple years. I've worked in tech and there's been a ton of layoffs in tech the last couple years, even from like really major companies. And the environment just feels different when I'm like been looking for a job the
Mhm.
past couple years. And it's felt harder. I haven't gotten recruiter reach outs. I will I would apply to a ton of jobs and hear nothing. As soon as I updated my LinkedIn, I started getting recruiters reaching out to me again, which is a thing that hadn't really been happening for a while. Even with the current job that I got, I basically applied to Google in the morning, reached
Mhm.
out to the hiring manager in the afternoon, and had him respond and set up a time to chat by that evening. The compensation I landed on with Google was 556,000. That's total comp. That's
Mhm.
including equity and everything.
Mhm.
But of course, at a company like Google, equity has value immediately, unlike a lot of startups. Um, and my last compensation was 200,000. So I went from 200,000 to 556 for my first. Everything on the new resume is just as true as everything that was on the last one.
Mhm.
Um, it's just presented so much better. And so it's like I came in with like a certain
Mhm.
skills and like nothing was embellished, but like I just didn't understand the best way to like present it. First of all, I'd just say that it's like so worth it. Cool.
Okay, so I have an exceptionally special guest here today. I'm here with Molly Pettit, a recently graduated client of mine who was amazing to work with. Molly, I guess for the people watching, would you mind doing a bit of an introduction about yourself in terms of like your background, your experience, and I guess how we ended up working together?
Yeah, so a quick summary of my background is that I historically have worked as an engineer, but the past 5 years have been much more focused on developer relations. Headed up a couple of developer relations teams. My last role was community product manager at Great Expectations. Um, and should I get into the new role at this point, or save that for later?
Sure, we can go into the new role. Yeah.
Just quickly, yeah. So the new role that I'll be starting soon is a developer relations engineer with Google, focused on platform AI, which I'm very excited about. And the way that I was first introduced to Alex was a cold reach out message on LinkedIn and or
Email.
email.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and I actually have since, and maybe even before, like I've received a few different ones with people saying, "I notice you're looking for jobs. Like,
Mhm.
would you like to work with me to like help you find one?" So it's not the first time I'd gotten one.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't know, for some reason, like something about the reach out, I decided to respond and like, sure, let's do a phone call. So we did a call
Mhm.
and I remember being like, okay, this sounds great, but I also was pretty hesitant. It's like a lot of money to put down, and or like it felt like that, especially when you're like, I don't know this person, and I don't know like what does this actually look like, and like is this
Mhm.
actually gonna increase my chances, and like um, so I was really nervous at the time,
Mhm.
and I ended up moving forward despite kind of like I I almost didn't. But I did end up moving forward because I was like, you know what? Like I remember a time where recruiters reached out to me. And I remember a time where like I would be able to get that first phone call.
Mhm.
But the atmosphere has just been different the last couple years. I've worked in tech and there's been a ton of layoffs in tech the last couple years, even from like really major companies. And the environment just feels different when I'm like been looking for a job the past
Mhm.
couple years. And it's felt harder. I haven't gotten recruiter reach outs. I will I would apply to a ton of jobs and hear nothing.
Mhm.
So I was like, okay, it's worth a shot. Like let's give it a go. Um, And I'm very happy I did. It was excellent working with you, which I can go into more, but that's like how we first got in contact and kind of like how I was feeling about that.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think for context as well, what was the reason that, because when we first spoke, you weren't actively looking for a role, right? Um, and do you remember? So I remember when we had kind of the conversation, you reached back out and you said, "Hey, I think I want to move forward." And then when we had that follow-up conversation, you kind of had a big hesitancy around moving forward, but it wasn't actually around me. It was more around, I guess, um, it was more around your confidence in finding something you had before. Do you remember that conversation we had?
Yeah, I do. I think
Yeah, cool. So we started working together. And then what was I guess like the first thing that we worked on? And yeah, what was the experience like with that?
yeah, so if I recall correctly, the first thing we worked on was revamping my resume.
Hmm.
Um, so I sent my current resume, um, and uh, a few different roles that kind of resent like summed up the types of things I was looking for. And because I have a pretty varied background, I was actually like I believe the three roles I sent over as like potential things I'm looking for were actually like different. They were different types of roles.
Hmm.
Had some overlap, but I intentionally did that because to like signal that um, I can fall into a few different buckets, and I want to try to make sure that my resume reflects that,
Hmm.
which is kind of hard to do. So uh, the first thing that happened after that was um, Alex and Paul
Hmm.
did a first draft. No, before the first draft of the resume, um, Paul came up with a bunch of questions for me to get more information about my work, to try to get some like numbers around things, and just really flesh it out with more focus on uh, like the outcomes gained at these places so that they could just be talked about in more detail. So I answered all the questions as best as I could. Um,
Hmm.
and from there, then there was a not only a pass at like a totally revamped resume, as well as revamped LinkedIn, what I would be putting on my LinkedIn. Um, and the thing that was really nice is that like so the main body of the resume that focused on each specific job was very specific to, of course, those roles, but the top portion was adjustable. There was a bunch of different segments that related to specific kinds of roles.
Hmm.
And the whole point is that I could like adjust which of those were included in order to better target for the particular role that resume was going towards. Um, which was really great because it was a really nice way for people to very quickly make sense of my varied background. And I actually had a recruiter during a call say to me, "Your resume is really great. It was really easy to like find the information I needed." Um, so that was pretty cool. Yeah, I had some recruiters complimenting it. But
Yeah.
also, like a thing I would say quickly is like as soon as I updated my LinkedIn, I started getting recruiters reaching out to me again, which is a thing that hadn't really been happening for a while.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so I know for you when we made all these changes and then you started going out into the market,
Yeah.
things just started popping off really, really quickly for you. So
Hmm.
do you remember like I guess how many interviews or like how many companies that you ended up getting into contact with?
Ooh, I could check my spreadsheet if you want exact numbers. But I'm really bad at guessing. Do you have a recollection? Do you
It
want
was
me
a
to?
lot. It was a lot.
It was a
Yeah.
lot. It
Yeah.
was quite a bit.
Yeah.
I could go check if you'd like, but I do remember just like a pretty
Mm.
regular stream and a lot more just like getting to that first call, but also things moving forward. I think pretty rarely did they stop there.
Yeah.
Um, and some of those were because I like reached out directly to the
Mhm.
hiring manager as you had, helped instruct on like how to best do that and how to find out who they are and things. And so there were several times, actually, even with the current job that I got, I basically applied to Google in the morning, reached out to the hiring manager in the afternoon, and had him respond and set up a time to chat by that evening. So, um,
Yeah.
yeah, that was awesome.
That's amazing.
Felt pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you did you also did kind of like a it was almost like Fang bingo for you in terms of interviews because you were it wasn't just Google that you were in contact with. There was a bunch of different companies that you spoke to.
True.
Yeah, like
hmm
do you want to maybe rattle off a few of them off the top of your head?
Yeah. So, talked to Stripe, talked to Facebook, Amazon.
Hmm.
There were also a bunch of startups I talked to
Hmm.
that were quite interesting.
Hmm.
I think eventually I just realized that I was more interested. I'd been in startups the past few years
Hmm.
and I was ready for like a more settled, bigger company.
Hmm.
And so I started focusing more in that direction.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, those are some that come straight to mind. There were a ton more.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know the exact.
Snowflake's another one. I was
Yeah,
just trying to think of what are like big names that people might recognize. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. I don't know the exact number. I think we got up to like I don't know between like I think we got up to around about 10 at least for those initial conversations. And then at one point, you turned off the tap. Like there were a few other opportunities that you're like, hey, like I've got a couple of buns in the oven, everything's looking really good. Like no more. Like I've got enough, I've got enough to know that I think I'm probably going to get an offer, which is a really good spot to
Yeah.
be in.
Yeah, I was feeling really busy preparing for the Google interview and I had like a number of other interviews in progress but it just became pretty clear to me that I didn't want to work at a startup anymore. So even, yeah, I ended up just like stopping those processes, reaching out to them, being like, so thank you so much for your time, but I've decided this isn't what I'm looking for right now. So I stopped those in order to like focus in
Mm,
on the companies that I was more interested in at the time.
for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's talk about that because I know that there was it wasn't just Google that you were seriously considering right at the end. I know that there was another
Yeah.
company that kind of came quite close. So yeah, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I also had been in conversations with Snowflake for many months.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, I got basically there was like a role kind of potentially opening up. Is it worth talking about like how I first got in contact with them?
Yeah,
Or
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, so that actually happened through connections. I have a friend
Hmm.
who were in similar space, and basically anytime one of us is looking for a job, well, we keep up in between that as well. We chat every once in a while, but whenever one of us is looking, we just kind of let the other know, and like if we can facilitate introductions, we like do that. So I let this friend know, and they facilitated an introduction to someone who then facilitated an introduction to someone at Snowflake. And from there, ended up in there were a couple different roles in different departments that um, fit my background.
Hmm.
So I started going through those processes. And there was a role opening like about to be available, but that wasn't posted yet,
Mhm.
that they were interested in me for. But they hadn't quite like it kind of it was a slow moving thing because they hadn't quite posted it, but I was like in conversations.
Mhm.
So when I got the uh, role offer from Google,
Mhm.
I reached out to them and just let them know, hey, FYI, I have this offer. Do you like, is the timeline right such that it makes sense for us to continue talking about this other role?
Mhm.
They ended up deciding that the timing did make sense. They got the role opened and published. And we kind of quickly, actually very quickly, they put together
Yeah,
an interview process so that I could um, do that while in a timing that worked for me, because I didn't want to drag on also the Google offer for too
of
long.
course. Yeah. And so that's kind of like a pretty nuanced situation, right? Like it's, you can there's kind of like a right way to approach those types of situations, and there's kind of a wrong way to approach those types of situations. And I think the way that we kind of worked out how to approach that worked out really, really well in terms of the fact that, they had this opportunity that was kind of amorphous, like they hadn't really kind of figured out exactly what it looked like, and they hadn't really made it a priority to, put people to interview people. And then when you came to them and said, hey, I do have this offer from Google, but you came to them in the right way, suddenly that kind of changed their energy. And then they got their butt into gear and they started to line up interviews for you. Right.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and so, but I also remember that the level of the role as well originally wasn't quite as high as what it ended up being when you first entered into the process.
Yeah, so um I forget exactly what the like numbers associated with it was, but originally
Mm.
I believe the role was affiliated with a senior manager
Hmm.
level.
Hmm.
Um, and when they found out about the Google offer and we started the process of moving forward, they basically said to me that they would, in order to compete with Google, uh, be willing to have that go up to a director level role.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we went from basically like, no interviews, like not a lot happening, to suddenly a huge pipeline of interviews, interviewing with like Amazon, Facebook, Google, Stripe, having an offer from Google, and then kind of like leveraging that in the right way to kind of get another company to come to the table. Again, also a really great company, right? Snowflake. And then kind of
Yeah.
bumping you up to director level. Not just in order to compete, but I would say honestly to kind of meet you where your value actually lay, because you're more than competent at performing at a director level. It's just that having that kind of extra incentive and seeing, I guess, other companies kind of value you at that level as well kind of helps companies to see you correctly in like the right light, right? And not just
Yeah.
from the way you interview, but also from like, hey, she's amazing, but also like we can see as well that she's clearly a hot commodity in the market, so we need to get our butt into gear. So I'd love to so yeah, so where did we end up at the end of this process between the two?
Yeah. So I ended up going with Google.
Hmm.
Um, is this where it makes sense to talk about like compensation?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, I ended up going with Google, not just for compensation. There's a lot of reasons I went with Google, reasons I was really excited about it. But yeah, the compensation I landed on with Google was 556,000. That's total comp. That's
Mhm.
including equity and everything.
Mhm.
But of course, at a company like Google, equity has value immediately, unlike a lot of startups. Um, and my last compensation was 200,000. So I went from 200,000 to 556 for my first year.
Pretty big jump.
Hmm.
Nice. So,
Plus all
um,
the other great benefits of working at Google. Yeah.
yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
So, I mean, like what made you decide to go, like compensation aside, like what made you decide to end up working with Google versus Snowflake?
Yeah. Um, there's a few reasons. Let's see. I really like their culture, but I also really like Snowflake's culture. So that's not actually a distinguisher between the two of those, but it is something that I really like about Google. Um, Things that are more distinguishers would be like um, there's more flexibility, so that's one thing. For Snowflake, I'd have to go into the office every day,
Mhm.
and the office is in right now it's in Peninsula, but it's going to move even further away to like South Bay. Anyway, it would have taken me an hour to get to work. And they're pretty, I would have had to do that a few days a week at least.
Mhm.
Um, at Google, they still want hybrid, where I go to the office, but it's in San Francisco, which is where I live, so that's much easier for me.
Mhm.
Additionally, something that was important to me was occasionally being able to work remotely,
Mhm.
um, some amount of the year, to go visit family or just work from a different location. And I had a good chat with my uh, the hiring manager about it, who was very supportive. Not only that, Google actually has a policy for all employees that everybody can work from wherever, like from other places remotely for at least like for a month out of the year.
Mhm.
But like I also with like depending on your manager, like that could be more, but no matter what, you're guaranteed that much time. So
Mhm.
that's cool. I also something that appealed to me is like at a company like Google. Well, first of all, I'm very excited about my role, and I don't
Mhm.
have any worry about joining and like not enjoying it. I think it's going to be amazing.
Mhm.
Um, but let's say time passes or there's a reorg or something changes and I'm like no longer excited about the exact thing I'm doing.
Mhm.
At Google, they make it really easy to apply to work in a different role at the company. And so it feels that is like its own different kind of flexibility where like if I want to change at some point, I don't have to go through a whole new process. Like they have so much going on at Google that I can probably find another thing at that point that I'd be really excited about. So, I think that felt pretty exciting for me. Those are some of the big things. And then those are the main ones, I think. Yeah, those are the
Yeah.
main ones.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I mean, that hits
Hmm.
on so many of the things that I know that you were really looking for when
Yeah.
when we first started the program. So it was honestly, it was really awesome to see you kind of land that plane and then have everything line up perfectly. Yeah,
Very exciting.
it was really exciting.
Hmm.
Let's talk about the negotiation piece. So
Yeah.
yeah, so that got I don't say dicey, but there was quite a bit of back and forth at that end stage because you were kind of juggling the conversation with Snowflake as well as Google. Yeah, do we want to let's kind of dive into that a little bit. What was that like? Kind of from, starting from I guess like offer stage and then how we
Yeah.
navigated that conversation.
Yeah, sure. No matter how much experience I have, I like how often I have these conversations, they always feel at least a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I think it's just baked into it. Well, so first of all, I would mention that like something that you pushed me towards in a very positive way that I don't think I'd really done before was starting the anchoring like immediately. Like
Mhm.
in the very first conversation with the recruiter,
Mhm.
like setting a high anchor point. Not like, I mean, like it was within what I was seeing in the market. But like setting a really good anchor point, such that when would come time to conversations later, we were already anchored in a good place. And I think that's just not, I think, I know that is something that I like hadn't been doing before.
Mhm.
Um, and so by the time we got to that first offer, I feel extremely confident that it was already likely much higher than it would have been um, otherwise.
Mhm.
So yeah, I got that first offer. Um, in between, like basically every time I got a new offer, uh, you and I would jump on a call, and chat through kind of like what the next step is and what would make sense as the next um,
Mhm.
request back. And that was really helpful. Yeah, you were very hands-on, uh, especially during that critical time. I mean, you were hands-on through the whole thing, but like we talked a lot in those weeks, in those like last couple weeks, because it was just like this very critical point,
Mhm.
um, in kind of like getting everything finished off. Yeah, and I think the back and forth, we probably went back and forth like, I don't know, four or some three or
Mhm.
four at least times in the span
Yeah.
of like a week and a half.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, to some people listening to that, that might sound like a lot, you know what I mean, to go back and forth with a company in terms of negotiation, because, you might think, oh, I might make a counter offer. And then it's kind of like, I get like, this counter offer and then that's it. And then usually most people settle at that point if they are going to negotiate. Um, but I think we did a really good job at, I guess, getting you the compensation that you are genuinely worth, right? And I think you also had a bit of like kind of bit of information around what that was like inside a company like Google, because obviously they have, large companies do have like certain levels that they've got to stay within, and so you had a bit of context around like where we ended up and what that actually meant, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, do you want to maybe highlight that a little bit or talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's like public context, like levels.fyi,
Yeah.
where you can find information. And then because I live in the Bay Area, I know a ton of people that work at Google. And so it was also pretty easy to fact check,
Mhm.
um, or just, yeah, check on where the numbers lined up, uh, for this kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. Um,
Mhm.
so that was really good to see. And I know that like that last little bit, that last little push, it was like, I remember kind of going back and forth. You were like, "Hey, what should I ask for? Should I ask for this?" And I said, "Look, I think this is the last one." I said, "But look, let's go for this specific amount." And and I
Yeah.
kind of explained my reasoning, and you were like, "Okay, cool, I'm just gonna go for it." And I remember you came back, and you were like, "They said yes," and I was like, we were like, "Yes," and it was a little bit
Mhm.
more than what we thought was potentially possible. So it's very strategic, and I'm really glad that we did that final push. Because again,
Yeah.
you're amazing at what you do, and you genuinely deserve that level of compensation. And so, yeah, it was a really good feeling on my end.
Thank you.
Cool. So, I mean, obviously you're starting this new job, everything's really exciting. But I feel like we've kind of gone through, I guess, like a little like the high level stuff or like the bits and pieces of the program. I mean, aside
Hmm.
from everything else we've spoken about, like what else did you find really helpful about working with me and the program, and any other takeaways at all?
Yeah. Few different things. One is I almost have an urge to write some of these down because if I don't, I might I have like three in my head at once.
Sure.
Um,
Go for it. Yeah. No rush here.
uh, yeah.
Maybe I'll like
Uh,
speed this up in an edit.
Actually, maybe I'll, yeah, I'm just gonna start. We'll see. So,
Sure.
one of the things is that, uh, oh my God, I just had it in my head. There was a specific thing I wanted to talk about. Um,
For context, I know you just
oh,
need to.
I remember. So one of the things that was super helpful was that you helped. I remember even before my very first call, um, we got on a call and you helped me think through how to introduce myself well. which
Mhm.
seems really simple. But like you had a very specific method about like, okay, this is the way that
Mhm.
you should talk about yourself, um, such that like in your introduction, they get a ton of really good information about you that is very specific to what they want to know about this role.
Mhm.
And um, like if you've done a really good job, like it'll be back to their turn or like you'll finish and they'll be like, oh, wow, you answered several of my questions. Amazing. And that actually happened many times. We're like, oh, great, you like answered a bunch of things I was going to ask about.
Mhm.
And it also meant that like at the very start of a phone call, when people asked for my intro, um, I highlighted a bunch of things that I felt was really important for them to know that if I hadn't done it at the outset, we might not have gotten to because they maybe wouldn't have asked the right question to let me highlight a thing
Mhm.
that was really important.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, so that was really great. There was also kind of strategy around like, okay, how to figure out who the hiring managers are, how to like best reach out so that you're more likely to get a response.
Mhm.
Um, and uh, you were very hands-on um, and responsive to the point that like I didn't like I would get new interviews and I wouldn't like there was never a point where I was like, come on, can we please catch up? That never happened. It was like I'd have a new interview. You were like, great, let's schedule a time to catch up so you can prepare for it. And it was just so easy. Um, and regular check-ins like when it mattered, like, when there was something to
Mhm.
to chat through and either both like when there was like a new interview,
Mhm.
but also like especially with negotiations. Um, and then the other thing is that I don't really view this as like, okay, you know, this covers this round of looking for jobs. I actually think I like gained a bunch of very useful like strategy and thinking about how to best market myself and like how to like get in touch with people
Mhm.
that I think is going to help me also when I'm like at a future time when I'm looking for jobs. So it's not like a one-off thing.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
So actually, I'd love to talk a bit more, I guess, about that, like the networking piece, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're someone who like you come from a background of helping develop communities, so you know a lot of people, right? So I'm curious, as someone who knows a lot of people and who generally has kind of an established network, like what did I teach you that was kind of like, you know, different or new, or you know, what did you really take out of it that you didn't have before?
That's a good question. I will say on the networking piece,
Mhm.
I it's something I already knew was really important and already was like doing to some
Mhm.
extent. I've even had like a spreadsheet of like
Mhm.
people that I wanted to keep in contact with who are in my kind of in my field. However, it was like sorely out of date and I hadn't really been keeping up with it lately. Like I had been better, especially when I was a freelancer.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think if anything, it like really reinvigorated my like, okay, it's quite helpful to keep up with this. But it's not even just from like
Mhm.
the thing is, it's not just like a um from a place of like, what can people do for me? I need to keep in touch with them so they could do stuff for me. It's like I also just really enjoy having connections with people
Mhm.
and like I'm also very happy to be on the receiving end of like if one of those connections like w wants an introduction or whatever. It's like if I know other cool people in the space and I can facilitate, then awesome. And so yeah, I think if anything, it just kind of like was a reinvigorator for me to like keep more up with that and like
Yeah.
keep track of folks I want to keep up with.
Yeah, 100%. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it is something that people know that they should be doing more of, right? And I guess you're quite unique in the fact that you already had a lot of, I guess, like the intrinsic skills around that. And so it was more about like just having someone to help kind of reignite that and maybe give
Yeah.
you a couple of pointers and say like, hey, like maybe approach this like this and this like this. And you kind of just ran with that, which was amazing. You know, like some people I work with don't necessarily have those intrinsic skills. And so it takes a little bit of time to kind of like instill those and say, hey, okay, now you've got those skills. Now here's how you go out and you know, message people and that type of thing. But that was one of the great things
Yeah.
about working with you is that you kind of already had that, and all I really needed to do was to give you a few pointers, kind of like a framework with it, and then you were kind of off to the races, which was, you know, which is awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I think being a freelancer, like, really, I mean, you're constantly having to like chat to people and like have feelers out there when you're freelancing. So I think that like gave me a head start with some of that.
Yeah, for sure, 100%. Um, I'm curious as well. I mean, sorry, I know I know you're quite tired because you've just had a big holiday and you're still a little bit jet lagged. So I appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Yeah.
So I won't keep you too much longer. Is you know, if somebody was kind of like thinking about doing the program, thinking about working with me, you know, what advice would you have for them?
Oh, what advice would I have for them?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'd just say that it's like so worth it. Um, I uh yeah, yeah, there's so many things that I feel like I have a better understanding of how to like go about it.
Mm,
What would okay, advice I would give for
mm,
people. Um, I mean, I would say that like God, I don't even know. Maybe that okay, there are certain things that like isn't just going to be about what you can do for them. Like some of it is like guidance about what they need to do. Like they need to put in some work also and like
mm,
um uh and that you know, just revamping the resume may get more people reaching out to them, but like really thinking through that like how to introduce themselves and like
mm,
um the networking and all of that is stuff that only they can do.
mm,
Um And then I also like the Slack that you put together is quite helpful and full of a bunch of other lovely people who are working with you. And it's a good resource for, you know, posting questions and um, yeah, to kind of utilize that. And like I didn't end up chatting to everybody, but I did schedule some like one-on-ones with various people in the group too, just to like kind of network within that.
mm.
Um, I don't know. So that's what comes to mind. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. No, it was great working with you, Molly. So to give to definitely give you props as well. I mean, anyone watching this might look and think, oh wow, like, you know, 200,000 to, you know, 556,000 working with a career coach, like that's a huge jump. And you know, I definitely gave you some really good tools and some really good frameworks, and obviously you saw some really good results from that really quickly, right? But I can't take full credit for that, right? Like that wasn't
Mm,
100% me. So on the point that you just made, it's also like the person coming into it, right? So you had a lot of the really good elements that made a lot of those things work. Like you were genuinely really, really good at your job. And you know, you just needed like a bit of help with like the resume and the LinkedIn and some pointers in terms of like how to present yourself, right?
yeah.
And then, but ultimately you were the person who actually went out and implemented that, right? So, you know, for anyone watching, I guess if you're someone who is genuinely good at their job, but they're kind of struggling in terms of their job search and things of like their resume, how to network, how to like interview, like that type of stuff, like that's the thing that I can help you with, right?
Hmm.
So, yeah, but I do also want to give you some more props as well, because I know that when you had an interview process with Google, I gave you a lot of tools and frameworks, and I help you kind of approach that in terms of introducing. But you did also take a lot of onus on yourself to do a lot of prep work as well, right? And leverage and get resourceful, and you know, speak to friends that were more technically minded to kind of help with like the technical preparation as well. And that was, I think, big
I
part
did
of
mock interviews. I like
yeah,
took
yeah.
courses. There was a
It,
lot of prep for that for sure.
yeah, and so it was I can't take full credit. It was a combined effort. And I think like that's kind of how you go from 200,000 to, 556,000 is like you kind of have this stack of one, obviously effort, because you put in a lot of effort to implement a lot of the stuff, and two, like the right strategies as well. And also the right combination, the right person. Like you had a really good skill set, right? And that's kind of how we managed to navigate that process and make that happen.
Yeah, like I mean, like if you just look at revamped resume, for example, like it's not like everything on the new resume is just as true as everything that was on the last one.
Hmm.
Um, it's just presented so much better. And so it's like I came in with like a certain skills and like nothing was embellished, but like I just didn't understand the best way to like present it.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's just like one small piece, but
Yeah,
um,
for sure.
knowing how to best market yourself is not something that we like, I
Yeah.
don't know, it's not built into our jobs.
No, of course not. I mean, it's something everyone kind of tries like every couple of years. They go out there, they maybe grab like a template that they've been using for ages and they'll just put in a couple of extra details, right? Like,
Yeah.
or maybe they might put in some effort, go on to YouTube and they try and become an expert, right? In something they're doing
Yeah.
temporarily.
Okay, I know this is delayed, but I thought of one piece of advice, but this is something I want to try to do in general with future jobs, which is when we did the resume and I gave my current resume and I got back a bunch of questions. I didn't know the answers to a bunch of the questions because they were from past jobs and it was like, what percentage increase was there of, XYZ while you were working like due to these efforts? And I'm like, I have no idea. And so I think a piece of advice I would actually give people, both for current and like future, is like start tracking that.
Mhm.
Have
Yeah.
it ready so that when you are
Yeah.
looking for a new job, that you have those numbers. Grab them before you leave. Um, yeah. So that's a
Yeah.
piece of advice I have because that's something that I just have not done
Mm.
as well as I could have.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the good thing is that like now you have kind of a historical artifact that you can call
Hmm.
on. And you can just use that same document and just put in all the projects that you work on, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
And also, this is something that I also kind of speak about as well, but I'm curious, when you went through that process of kind of answering those questions and digesting, get it down on paper, did you find it a lot easier to speak about those projects when you were actually interviewing?
Yeah, I would imagine so because like I just haven't talked about some of those in a long time.
Yeah.
So I do think it made it easier, but even still, something I did upon like based on your advice was continue to flesh out various projects, especially ones that were relevant for particular jobs, so that either I could talk about them in my introduction or would be prepared if they wanted an example of something similar or whatever. And so it did help to answer those questions. And it was additionally very helpful to like flesh out what was it? It was like, what's the problem? Like, what was the solution? There was like a few
Yeah,
bullets
yeah,
you
it was a
probably
step by
have.
step.
Yeah.
That's all right.
Um, and yeah, so that was additionally helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Molly, it was an absolute pleasure working with you. And yeah, it was I'm so excited for you and your new job. How much it's I know how much of a how hard you worked in order to get there and how much work we did in order to, I guess, change the trajectory of your career. And it made me really happy to see you get into a spot where you can do all of the things that you want to do and get paid what you're worth. So
I'm so
um
excited.
yeah, me too. I'll wrap it up here. I know you're a little bit jet lagged, so I'll let you go. But yeah, any closing remarks, any final words, or
Oh, I don't know. I don't think I have any final words except that I'm really glad that I worked with you. I think it helped. I was in a very complacent spot, I think, when we talked, where I was like, yeah, this isn't like the perfect place for me, but like things haven't been really, I've kind of ended up feeling that way at the last couple places and, wanting to find something that felt really good. But it was just, I think I was just feeling demotivated and like that wasn't going to be possible. Like I was going to land a new thing and it was just going to feel the same. Um, and so I just was in yeah, a very meh, whatever, just like chugging along, demotivatedly. It's probably not a word, but in a demotivated fashion. And so I'm just really grateful that we worked together and I don't know, helped light a fire under my butt and find something I'm so pumped about. So thanks for all the help.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Mm.